I like the kind of establishment here and the reinforcing of the fact that Jedi are seen as like a cultural authority within the galaxy, at least amongst certain species, etc. The fact they were all
Like
recognizing and
Barabas.
turning to him, yeah, exactly, turning to him with very specific notions of, oh, you're a Jedi, this is what you do, this is what you're good for, this is what you can offer us. This is your responsibility, etc. The fact that Luke isn't just dealing with the fact that I'm not familiar with this as a skill set, but also I'm not necessarily ready or even comfortable to take on this role, even if I did have these skills, I thought was a really interesting choice.
The characters tend to have more to do with one another this time around than in the first one, because the first one needed to take the time to kind of set up the board, so to speak. So they're kind of running into each other more often. Their actions have more direct and immediate and consistent sort of consequences from scene to scene. And so when they're weighing their next move, it feels a little bit more like high stakes and like you're only going to get one shot at this, and you better choose right.
Speaking of the climax, I really had a moment of catharsis when Phalia got exposed by Leia turning on the comm and listening to that whole speech, and then the fleet instantly turning against him. I mean, there's something about that was very satisfying.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, and welcome back to Fanalysis Star Wars. I'm Canon, this is Matt.
Hey everybody, welcome.
And this is Evan.
Greetings.
Today we're going to be covering Book 2 of the Thrawn Trilogy, Dark Force Rising. It's a miracle I remember that title this time, because I always forget that one. We all do, actually, don't we?
It's the worst title.
By far.
Not to be confused with Dark Forces, the video game series.
That as well, yeah, adds to add confusion to the list. But yeah, we all love this book, don't we, guys? Who wants to take it off? Start with this one.
I mean, I don't use this phrase lightly. It is what I would refer to as a perfect sequel. Pretty much every complaint, few that there were that came up in Heir to the Empire for me, were basically addressed in this. And a lot of that really just comes down to, if I could really just narrow it to two specific qualities that differentiate this book from the previous, is that the characterization and even just the style of writing has really jumped up. Again, not that either of those things were bad in Heir. It's just, I definitely feel like Timothy Zahn in this book, like, okay, I've introduced these characters, I'm more comfortable with them. Now I'm really going to kind of, stretch my muscles a bit with, my writing and really show you what I can do. And I definitely feel like, not that he was floundering in Heir to the Empire either, not even in the slightest. It's just, yeah. It's just that the characters, particularly the ones that were introduced in the previous book, to me feel a lot more well-rounded than they did in the previous one, and how they're really woven into the narrative of the OT trilogy characters that we obviously know and love, I think has vastly improved from the previous one. So, like I said, really those were just the only things that I had any even remote issue with Heir to begin with. So seeing that just improve in such a noticeable way here is just fantastic to see.
Yeah, part of that for me is that he's just naturally had the time to get them established. He's not having to reintroduce us to them the same way he did with the first book, so that helps by itself. But like you say, the quality of the writing in terms of how much, or the quality of the craft and how he's deciding to use his characters has improved for this one. He makes a much more concerted effort, I think, or it feels that way to me anyway, that to weave those characters in equal measure with the original trilogy characters. Whereas before they were being onboarded into the reader's awareness. Now he can really treat them as though they were always around and always part of the kind of crew, which is not an easy thing to do when you've got characters of the stature of the original trilogy in terms of like the reader's hearts. These characters are beloved, so bringing new faces into the mix and having them feel like they're well integrated and kind of coming to be a part of the team in the various ways that they are, I think is very well handled. The balance of how much time he spends on each as well, not just what they're doing within the larger plot, but the kind of the hot swapping between them, 2 here, 3 there, this one's on its own for a bit, that kind of thing. He apportions it all very well. It never feels to me like the pacing is dragging or that we're spending too long on this sort of sequence. Even when we dip a little bit further into one of the more continually covered arcs, like things, for example, the Noghri with Leia and Chewie, or the basic rehash that did not feel like a rehash in any bad way of the Death Star Princess Leia's rescue with Card. You're spending quite a bit of time in those particular characters' headspaces there, but it never feels like it's dragging. Like the pacing is kept quite neat and quite self-contained. It's very effective for me.
To your point about interweaving the characters, I feel like his transitions from scene to scene in this book is also a pretty stark improvement, because what he'll often do is maybe he'll have like Thrawn mention something with the Noghri, and then we'll immediately cut to Leia and the Noghri, or we'll have Luke and Lando maybe reminisce a little bit about the duty of a Jedi, and then we'll immediately cut to Joruus C'baoth thinking about something, or we'll maybe have like Pelion thinking about the Emperor, and that kind of leads into something having to do with Mara Jade. Just like little setups like that, and how it kind of weaves. It feels a lot less like, okay, smash cut, this is what this character is doing. Smash cut, this is what this character is doing. Which, again, little things like that really make the entire fluid is really the word I'm really looking for with this, because the way even though so much happens in this book, everything sort of coalesces into a really, what I would call a very effective climax. So again, it's really, again, not the easiest thing to do, and kind of like what we said in our Andor review, making a world feel lived in is also important with these characters, because kind of like when Matt, you said something like when you turn the TV off, you want to think that this universe is still going. Well, with these characters, when you put the book down, you could sort of think to yourself, oh yeah, they've always been there, kind of like what Callan said. So again, having that sort of consistency really, really is important in any piece of fiction, honestly, and especially when you're connecting it to a larger world like this.
Yeah, you mentioned Andor. It's funny because this book, obviously, this came out far, far before Andor, but the feeling of it going through it feels very much like it's kind of drawing on the same things that made Andor successful. If the first book could be best kind of adapted into a film, this one would much better be served by a TV series. It feels kind of more long form in its craft, and I've always enjoyed that personally. So yeah, I like that for this one.
I was going to say that one of you, I think it was Evan, just a few moments ago mentioned the quality of the writing in terms of like his scene transitions, or just the blending of character thoughts or actions or concepts or whatever. And I think that this one more than the first one, and the first one's good, but this one more than the first book feels like I can see it visually playing out like a cut, but it's much more like a mini series than a movie, because of all of what's going on, and some of the things that they're spending time on you just wouldn't make time for in a film. But not that it's filler or bad or anything like that. But yeah, so like to me it just feels like more like a perfectly done kind of like a perfectly cut sort of short form limited series television run rather than a film. This has always been like my favorite of these books. I don't know if that'll hold up because I haven't read the third one, The Last Command, in many, many years. So when we get around to that, maybe I'll reassess that one. But I've always considered this one like a jump in quality to Heir to the Empire, which is already high quality. Like you guys were saying, he's familiar with like the characters, familiar with having already written them with his first pass at it. But there's just something about I don't know, like almost all of it just feels like a perfect step for each character. Like the lines make sense, the thoughts they have when they have them make sense. Also, when they have like a thought that's kind of like in contention with what they really know to be like the larger business of like whatever their agenda is. If they have a thought like Han, for example, is constantly worrying about Leia being in danger and not wanting her to, for obvious reasons, and not wanting her to be in those positions, but he also like accepts, that it needs to happen. So it's a nice way of having the bit of doubt and then moving on and carrying on with the business of the scene, where it feels like a human reaction that doesn't waste time or feel inconsistent or we pick a side here. It all just feels right, feels correct.
On
Luke,
that one,
I think, is eternally patient though. Like I mean, there are
yeah,
bits where
sure.
like, I kind of want Luke to be a little bit just like, Luke, come on, like just you don't have to be fair-minded with everybody.
He's trying to be the best Jedi he can be, and working out what that means. Actually, that's well played. But on the point with Han in particular, just because I know this probably come up later, but don't want to lose the point. He does a very good job of having that threaded through the entire narrative and escalating it, kind of with the ebb and flow of the main story. I really enjoy the moments where Han's kind of sitting there at the cockpit, just thinking about Leia and worrying about her, etc. Coming to the kind of the peak of that when he's just airing to Lando the fact that, did you know we didn't even have one day together? Like, I've been away for a month. We got back. We didn't even have one day. I love that as a human kind of reaction and just kind of showing the kind of toll that the story is taking on these characters. That's not the point of it. The point is to kind of focus on their relationship and the humanization of Han, but it all weaves together and is so nicely tied into the fact that, hey, he's just having a moment with his friend. He's just airing some of his complaints and is getting some support. I love seeing these developments in characters that we just haven't had the time to sit in and spend time with them like this. In the original trilogy, if it had been a series, it would have done, but because it was a film, you have to be very careful with how you kind of apportion those moments and getting the time to spend on it. I really like that he's made these choices and chosen to do them as he has.
Well, I also really appreciate that too, because with Han in particular, him transitioning like into being a father, into being a leader, like this is obviously a very, very different, take for him compared to what he did in his youth. He was the smuggler, the scoundrel, the guy who didn't care about, pretty much anything, always just doing whatever he wanted to do. But having that sort of responsibility and that agency now really makes him feel much more well-rounded. Not that he wasn't in the original trilogy, of course. It's just this is a new side of him because this is a different, era that he's living in with different responsibilities. But they don't use that as a crutch to kind of manufacture drama in a way. A lot of his concerns kind of like, like with Leia, it's like he's concerned, but he understands the necessity of her duty and the necessity of the situation. They don't try and play it as this sort of awkward, family drama sort of thing. He's not happy about it, but he respects what she has to do, and he's going to do what he has to do because he knows that ultimately, what's going on is bigger than either of them individually, even with everything that they have done in the past.
There's a real maturity to the character that while we had that in the original trilogy, the kind of the development up to this point, it shows how much he's had to grow and how much he's rising to that challenge. And we see that in all of the characters and their different scenarios. I think you've seen that she was already a great diplomat, obviously, but Leia's coming into the more of a leadership role within that space. Whereas before it was just at the scale of the rebellion. Now she's having to be conscious of the fact that this is a galaxy that they're trying to run now, for the good of all. How that's causing friction between her and Mon Mothma and such. I like all of that.
Because if you think about it in the films, there's no hint of her being a great diplomat whatsoever.
Yes, yeah. We're told that she clearly is, but she's very
implied,
much like...
but you don't really get too much of it. So
I mean, she's cool and she's badass when she gets things done and she's good at what she does, but you never... The only diplomacy you ever see her engage in is like lying poorly to the Empire when she's caught. Like, and that's it. The rest of it, she's shooting people and giving orders and choking slugs, and that's it. Which is great and all that, but she's not a diplomat, like on camera. So it's really nice actually having that part of her be fully realized. That's not a flaw, by the way. I'm not saying it's a flaw in the films. It's just this is what the EU is for. This is an ideal usage of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I also appreciate too that like you could sort of view Garm Bel Iblis when he shows up as kind of like a juxtaposition to Han Solo in the sense of like this is kind of the evolution he's on as he becomes more of a leader, more of someone in touch like with government and the culture of Corellia. I don't know if it was like intended to be that, but I do appreciate how you could sort of see how this is where Han's at, and with Garm Bel Iblis, you could see, oh, maybe this is what he could eventually grow into in some form. So even if that's not intentional, I like that you could sort of read into that and come to your own conclusions, which is also something you need for really any sort of book.
Yeah, you mentioned before as well the relationship between the two is quite compelling. The idea, that single line of them that you referenced with the
I have it right here actually.
Yeah, go ahead, because when I got to it in the book, I was like, oh yeah, I like that as well.
Yeah. So this is when they first meet, and Garm Bel Iblis is essentially, he says, "I'm flattered that you still remember me. It'd be hard for any Corellian to forget you, sir," Han said, his numbed brain noting vaguely in passing that there were very few people in the galaxy who rated an automatic sir from him.
No, I really like that. I'd have one critique or edit for it in that I would have preferred to see it noted by someone else, like Lando, for example. From his perspective, I think that would have come across as a much stronger delivery. But just as a line and a concept as a whole, I think it was really cool to have that. Because we see, obviously, him referring to other characters as Sir throughout the book, Akbar being the prime example. But this is a relative stranger, complete stranger to the reader, so having that kind of come out and be noted on is a sign that it's just immediately is a way of conveying to the reader that, hey, this person is someone of significance. This is not just another side character. This person is going to mean something for the story. It's a very quick way of catching us up to who this person is supposed to be. Garm Bel Iblis.
I also appreciate the fact that it's not like he doesn't like say sir and then stop. He just says it because it is just so automatic. And then his internal dialogue is what kind of fills in the gaps a little bit. And also when you think about it, from what we know of Han Solo, like from the films and even in some of the EU works, that were out at the time, like, yeah, him saying sir without any sort of hesitation is a rarity for him, because he's always someone who's trying to stand up for himself and be the biggest personality in the room, so to speak. So the fact that someone like Bel Iblis can elicit this response, it's a good way of portraying characterization with just a few lines of text.
It was true for the first book, and even more so for this one, and I hope it continues to the book 3 as well, which from memory it does. But the two characters that kind of stand out to me the most in this book, that I enjoy the most, which is not particularly normal for me, are Han and Lando. They are so well realized in this story, and just the dynamic between the two, and the friendship, the different skill sets they're bringing to the story in plot terms, the kind of the quasi detective work they're doing, and with playing into the new skills they've picked up along the way, but also skills we're familiar with them from the original trilogy. Those two, I mean, I've always enjoyed them, don't get me wrong, but they've never been the kind of the characters that draw my focus. It's just not been the archetype that I lean towards within the story of Star Wars. But for this trilogy, that's always been the exception. These two are so fun to be around in the scene work. It's so nice to see that friendship, that dynamic kind of developed on. Because we hear a lot about how they've been friends and how they get along from the original films and other works. But this is the first kind of story where you're really seeing it in the good and the bad. Like, I like that there's friction.
Well, yeah.
I like that there's kind of they argue. I like the fact they disagree with things. But at the same time, there's that underlying support and understanding that really comes through for all the moments that they author Zahn used to sit in it.
Well, in the movies, Han Solo is sort of a character that I mean, he does mature, as you guys already said, over the course of the films, but he's more than most characters, kind of like a fantasy. You know what I mean? It's like he's a specifically, I don't mean to ruffle feathers or whatever, but like, just it's typical to refer to him as sort of like a male fantasy. You know what I mean? He's not tied down, he's not attached, he can shoot people if they get in his way, he has adventures, he doesn't answer to anybody. It's I don't know if you call it purely a power fantasy, but it's just like this kind of wild escapism. It's a little bit like in the way that a character like 007 or Indiana Jones, another Harrison Ford character,
he even gets the girl really to use that trope as well. Yeah,
true.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not really. Most characters of that kind are not expected to mature and don't need to. So it's kind of interesting to see them turn what could have been a more stereotypical kind of buddy cop duo into something that feels much more real, much more nuanced, as you were getting at there. I completely agree. And my favorite bit of this book has always been them. That in some sense they're kind of playing with like a loaded deck, because the Jedi stuff has always been my least favorite part of the whole trilogy in this, just because I don't particularly care about C'baoth at all.
Yeah.
But he's also not terrible. I was thinking about how he bothered me far less in this book than he did in the first one.
Agreed. Yeah, he's got more to do, I think, with the actual main cast as well. He's a lot more to the side
he is more
in the first book.
Yeah, he has more of a presence for one thing, and you learn a bit more about his past, and there's a lot more sequences where he's specifically a POV. So you kind of get inside of his perspective a lot more, and I think he definitely feels a lot more well-rounded. And it's not because, like, in the first book, like, yeah, we have those sequences between him and Thrawn, but then he kind of just goes off to his planet, and aside from a brief telepathic talk with Luke, he's really not much of a presence after that. So he definitely has a lot more agency in this book, and the fact that we do get those POV scenes, and I also like the fact that the way that his sort of madness is portrayed in the writing, because when you're inside his head, it's very different than in anybody else. Like, even early on, when in literally the first chapter of the book, we see from his perspective when he's thinking about his past, and how it's like even he has trouble sort of remembering who he was or where he came from. Obviously, we don't know that, whether or not he's a clone is still kind of like, we don't know all the ins and outs of that yet. But I really do appreciate how Timothy Zahn kind of like seeds those little breadcrumbs, and even just the way he describes the Force is kind of like this thing that he's kind of has to like take and kind of wrench down in order to kind of make him feel a little bit more sane. But then as he's kind of pulled away from it, you could kind of feel him becoming, it's almost like he's becoming like corporeal the less whenever he's not using the Force, if that makes sense. Because like he even sort of describes his memories as like threads that he needs to kind of really, you know, kind of grasp onto so it doesn't like
Yeah.
snap. And
These are
having
much
that
more.
perspective really interesting.
Yeah, these are more useful and like to the reader. I mean, I think than anything that happened in the first book, where he was just
Crazy
he
old
doesn't
hermit.
entirely he doesn't entirely transcend this issue in the series throughout the series, but it bothers me less. But in the first one, it wasn't just that he was what he was. It was the fact that every scene with him effectively was the same scene over and over and over again, and it was just like, I mean, even Thrawn was just like, "Tell him to stop bothering me, Captain," or like, "I don't have time for him,
Yeah,
Captain.
the stop. We're
Captain,
trying
he's
to move on with
crazy,
the story.
Captain."
Can we
Like,
stop referencing this
yes,
non-entity
yeah,
that
Pretty
doesn't
much,
affect the
yeah.
plot,
but
really?
you
Yeah,
know,
exactly.
and in this one, the way that they explore it, as you were just speaking about very well there, like I think it's much more interesting at the very least. Even though I don't love the character, it's at least worthy of the time being spent on it.
Mm.
I have always thought it's hilarious though that like Luke's just so nice. I don't know, R2. I think he may be Master C'baoth's insane. Just like sort of like just like you think. It's just
He's a
Yeah.
great
kind of like,
redeemer, though, isn't he?
yeah,
Is
But
Luke?
to
So
be fair though, I do like I do like that Luke picks up on that almost immediately, and the fact that
sure.
he
Well,
doesn't, because like there are
who
many
couldn't, you know?
yeah, but like there's a lot of like sequences where you could tell C'baoth's really trying to deliberately undermine the teachings of like, Ben Kenobi and
Sure.
Yoda, and Luke's just
Yeah.
not having
and
it.
also you've got
And
the big
again,
excuse of the
it goes
force
back to
suppression. Like he
yeah,
is literally dulling
yeah,
him, which is a huge part that gives the
yeah,
excuse there.
but it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the Han and Leia dynamic. I really appreciate the fact that they don't use that as, again, as a crutch to kind of manufacture some form of drama where like, because like I don't want to read a sequence where Luke is like, oh man, was Yoda wrong? Was Ben
Yeah,
really
exactly.
like, we don't need that. We don't need
Yeah,
any of that
exactly.
because
And also,
it's
even
very obvious what C'baoth is.
yeah, and even through the nulling effect, even through the deception, everything going on with Luke, we see Luke see through it. Like he perceives the potential issues at the start. He sees it getting worse. He thinks, okay, I'm not happy with this. And then when Mara comes to intercede, he doesn't. He just immediately knows this is wrong. I'm going to stand against you, even though he's in that weakened state. Before he ever gets in, it could have a weaker writer would have had it be that he was basically a slave to him until Mara brings the Salamari, effect into range, and then I've been awoken from my slumber. It's good that we don't lose the character. I mean, because he is one of the main characters from the original trilogy, right? We can't have a secondary character come and saving him without good reason. For the readers to buy into that, it would diminish the character journey we've already been on with him. So having them kind of meet together and save each other, as it were, in that scenario, was the perfect choice there.
I think I think C'baoth works best when he's really like portrayed as like the sort of force of nature. Like his character, like Matt was saying, is really not, even though it's vastly improved from the previous book, it's still really, you still kind of understand what he's all about, after only a few sequences. But I like that doesn't really bog down, because he's representative of something that Luke is very deliberately trying to avoid, and it's also a good way of showing the dangers of what can manifest when a powerful Jedi Master, clone or otherwise, goes off the deep end in this instance. Because a big section of Luke's arc is him trying to sort of, well, not only further his Jedi training, but just kind of his place in the galaxy as to what a Jedi, should be in this specific time. Because, as we obviously in the original trilogy, he was always fighting, the Empire and all that. But in this sort of situation, he needs to kind of approach things differently. And, I mean, that's perfectly encapsulated in Callan and I, we were talking about this the other day, the bar scene with the were they
One of my favorite
smugglers? It
scenes
was
in
a
the book.
Rhodian. It's a Rhodian and a Barabel. Barabel. Yeah. And they're having this disagreement about an exchange, because basically, again, this is really nice. The fact that they bring up the fact that New Republic credits and the current Imperial, there's no official exchange rate. So they call on Luke to be, the judgment in this. And the fact that Luke, him being called to serve as a Jedi in a diplomatic sense is not something he's used to. And that's a big part of his characterization throughout all of this. So it's a really nice way of showing, being a Jedi is not just, being on the front lines. Being a Jedi, you're a peacekeeper, you're a negotiator, you're someone who people are going to look to whether it's necessarily for the right reasons or not. That's the role that he's in. And at the moment, Luke's basically the only Jedi around, so he kind of has to take on all of this responsibility. Well, I should say the only Jedi around who has his head screwed on straight in this instance, which is it's interesting because we don't see a lot of that previously. So the fact that they're taking this in a new direction is nice, and you get to see little eventually, because we get to see little what's the phrase, seeds of what Luke will eventually grow into as like a complete Jedi Master, which is really nice to see because he has to start.
Yeah, on that point, on the Jedi Master bit, I was going to ask this a bit, but I didn't want to disrupt the flow when we got to the scene with the Barabel and the Rodian. But were they implying that Kenobi was not a Jedi Master? There was a bit where he specifically said that the only Jedi Master he'd ever known was Yoda. And then there was this talk about how when he was looking into C'baoth's past, there was the question of whether he'd self-appointed himself, like appointed himself a master or grabbed the style, rather than the honorific being bestowed by the order at large or whatever Luke's understanding of that was. Like, there was something about it that just felt like, well, the first one you knew was old Ben, but because he scooted straight past that to Yoda, and I get that you could look at it as he didn't have that much time training under Kenobi. You know what I mean? That's totally fair, but it was just kind of in their mind, was Kenobi only ever like a knight and never made it to like the rank of master?
It could be a holdover to the fact that this was a time when the kind of definitions were all so up in the air that he was thinking, okay, well, Obi-Wan had a lightsaber and Yoda didn't, and Yoda taught Obi-Wan, so maybe there is a rank differential there that carries across to Luke's perspective.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not the case now in the law, in the canon law, and in the ideas behind it before he even manifested. Yeah. But yeah, just that could just be that. But it was you're right that it did make allude to the fact that he wasn't
a little
the same level.
Yeah, it was just like skipping right past the guy who introduced me to the whole damn thing. But sure.
And I guess you could say, like in A New Hope, Ben does say, "I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father." So
yeah, he does. But in the same film, granted, Luke wasn't there for it, but Vader says, like, "When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master." Like, so it's like the implication being, like,
he was the master. Anyway, I guess. Yeah, maybe it could just be a slight flub. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out. It is worth pointing out there are a few continuity hiccups in this book that
they're the same thing from the first one with like the whole
just the Clone Wars time period
and
the time period.
Sure.
Like Leia once references talking about like the Noghri people and like what happened to them happened during the Clone Wars, and she said it was something like 45 years ago, but if you do the math, the Clone Wars wouldn't have started by then, based on like what we know about the prequel trilogy. But little things like that don't bog the story down in and of themselves, especially since there's such brief sequences. It's really not worth griping over in this case.
Yeah, on that point, I liked the well, you're right, the maths doesn't check out because obviously the books came out before there was the maths to be established on this. But I like the fact that we sit in the story of the Noghri and sit in the in her knowing about their history or perceived history, etc. Before dipping into the fact that it was it wasn't as short as you thought it was. It was much longer. The kind of gradual pieces of information that she gets before she draws that conclusion, I found very effective. It was self-justifying in how much time he was spending in that part of the story for her and Chewie. Very much like that. Also, just going back to the kind of Luke adjudicating scene, because it was one of my favorites in the book. Two other things I really liked about that. You mentioned obviously about the fact that Luke was using skills that he hasn't actually properly mastered at this point, being in that diplomatic force. But I like the kind of establishment here and the reinforcing of the fact that Jedi are seen as like a cultural authority within the galaxy, at least amongst certain species, etc. The fact they were all recognizing and turning to him, turning to him with very specific notions of, oh, you're a Jedi, this is what you do, this is what you're good for, this is what you can offer us. This is your responsibility, etc. The fact that Luke isn't just dealing with the fact that I'm not familiar with this as a skill set, but also I'm not necessarily ready or even comfortable to take on this role, even if I did have these skills, I thought was a really interesting choice. I think that works really well to kind of set up what we know will be his ultimate trajectory as the new Jedi Order comes about in the future. On top of that as well, the perpetual kind of blipping up of Niles Ferrier throughout the story. I thought this was a very good way of kind of reinforcing the fact that he was going to be coming back as frequently as he was. The fact that you had that slight win from Luke and reaching out and say that Niles Ferrier, could you step forward, please? Kind of bringing that fact to the currency translation for them and explain what the kind of rough exchange would be. Little background details like that. We said about the first book, but it's true of this one as well. He's very good at threading in world building kind of setting details into the story and into the character knowledge bases. It never feels like he's just saying, "Oh yeah, I want to make a point about money because that's something I'm interested in." It's relevant to this moment. It's relevant to the story. It's going to reinforce what this particular character knows later on, and also self-justify the fact that we're going to be spending time with this guy moving forward. It was a very neat scene for getting all of these pieces onto the board and in the right order, etc. All while ultimately just setting up the fact that Han is off getting collected by the Peregrines people. I just
well, to your point, yeah,
liked all of that.
Also like Lando's presence in that sequence too, because he's the bridge between Luke and Feria, because he sort of is the one who explains to Luke, oh yeah, the credit thing is what they're arguing over, and there is no official exchange rate. But I like that Luke kind of intuitively knows that Lando knows what the quote-unquote unofficial exchange rate was, even if he doesn't know the exact number. I like that at this point, he knows Lando well enough to pick up on that. Like, it's not just a Jedi thing. It's not it's not a Force thing. It's just a friend thing. You know this guy long enough. You know the circles he's been in. You understand all that. If anyone in this sort of area would know about it, he would. And I really appreciate that too. Again, it's saying a lot without directly saying it. And we even get a little of that earlier in the sequence when he first asked to mediate, because one of the few sequences in this book that actually made me chuckle was like the bartender when he's explaining to Luke what's going on. It's like, well, you're a Jedi, go mediate this.
Before they wreck the joint.
Like it's the most obvious thing in the world. Like, you're Luke Skywalker, aren't you? Yeah. Well, go settle this. And it's like, okay. It looks like, okay. Like, not like in a meek way, but like, I don't know, like something about the bartender, being the one to tell him that. It's a nice little, almost like an inverse in a way of like the cantina scene where everyone's like being super rude to Luke, but in this case, he's the one who has to settle it. Which I guess, to your point, I didn't even think of that until just now. This is almost like Luke's version of what happened at the cantina scene, except thankfully, unlike Ben, he doesn't have to chop anyone's arm off.
Yeah, and slightly more upmarket clientele to help with that as well. Only slightly.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to get into a discussion about Thrawn himself here soon, the character, because we kind of noticed that one of the reasons why we are enjoying this book as much as we were is because the characters tend to have more to do with one another this time around than in the first one, because the first one needed to take the time to kind of set up the board, so to speak. So they're kind of running into each other more often. Their actions have more direct and immediate and consistent sort of consequences from scene to scene. And so when they're weighing their next move, it feels a little bit more like high stakes, and like you're only going to get one shot at this, and you better choose right.
That's even stated Thrawn, a few times.
Yeah, exactly. For sure. I mean to say, but yeah, so Thrawn, he's kind of like a true bridging point this time. The linchpin of everything is what Callan just called him a minute ago off camera, because he's the character through which like the Mara perspective, for example, and like Card himself really kind of filter all their thoughts throughout all this. So like, why don't we get into a discussion about Thrawn himself? Where do we want to start with that?
Well, I think obviously he's not human, but like he feels a lot more, there's a lot more human qualities to him in this book than in Heir, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Again, not that there weren't in that book, of course, but like to me, like his sort of POVs, he's not just thinking about like the pure strategy or just the pure future. He's thinking about events, like you were saying, that directly coincide with the plot and his own conclusions. I like how they don't make him feel like omnipotent. Like he has certain flubs, but the flubs don't come off as cheap, and he does come to some pretty big conclusions about like, okay, this relates to this. The Noghri is clearly lying because their culture is like this, and then that means. But you buy it is basically what I'm trying to get at with this, in the way that he's portrayed. Like even when he's wrong, you understand why he's wrong, and when he's right, you understand why he's right. It's not too one way or the other. So he feels a lot more like a character who's actively trying to lead, the Empire into this new age and is in direct conflict with our characters. He's more than, he's not just a presence. He's actually like well, he is a presence, but he's a presence with more, I guess you could say, voice.
Yeah,
Do
he's
you
a
understand what I'm
presence.
getting at
He's a
with this?
presence to the other characters, but he's a character to us. That's I
Yeah.
think the stronger thing about this book. We're feeling the sense of threat that he represents to the others in the story, but we're also seeing the more he's a chiss obviously, but the human side of him, which I really like. I also like the fact that you brought up the flaws there, where he's coming to these conclusions. I like that we're getting to see the kind of the flaws being expressed through competence. Like he's making the same level of deductive reasoning and choice and decision making from that we've seen from the first book, and when he is right in this one, but when he's wrong, you're getting, okay, it's either the arrogance leading to this route, or it's the false information leading to this route. It's showing and manifesting in the story how this kind of personality, how this perspective can be so deeply flawed. And I also like as well that he the back and forth between him and Pelion. Most of the time, Pelion is the lesser of those two, but there are a few times in this book where he raises a point that ends up actually being accurate. And Thrawn kind of dismisses it, or says, no, we're going to go this route because of this. And so I like that we're seeing it's a very very light hand from Zahn's part, but he particularly drops those moments in to show this is ultimately going to be Thrawn's downfall. He's not omniscient. He does get things wrong, and obviously, as with all writing, it is a contrivance in the fact that the things he's getting wrong are necessary for the story to proceed the way it is. But it's always sold so well, like you said. It's you don't
feel like the pen is like
exactly.
behind his
you're
behind him at all times. You understand his sort of way of thinking in this moment. And to your point too, I just want to add, before you move on, I like the fact that the Noghri in particular seems to be his biggest sort of blind spot. In terms of the conclusions and the slip-ups that he does have, which obviously, because as we know, like in the third book, like the Noghri is kind of pretty much what ultimately leads to his downfall. And I like how that's set up here, because he views them as being so far below himself compared to everybody else, that he's even less willing to entertain the idea that they might be working against him in some way. And I think the Leia scene is the perfect encapsulation of that, when she's like trying to hide from him, and he's trying to like interrogate the matriarch and all that, and they're not actually telling him the full truth of like what's going on, obviously, but he thinks he's so far above them that there's no way that he could possibly miss anything. But it's a very believable thought process in that moment too. And it also gives the Noghri a lot more agency too, because obviously we learn a lot more about them in this book than we did in the previous one.
Yeah, we get a lot more on the Noghri for this one. I think that he was really trying to kind of reinforce that kind of culture and give more of a presence to the characters that are going to be relevant throughout this, because obviously we had that in the first book, but more of an antagonistic presence here. We're trying to seeing that switch from antagonist to neutral to allies. And obviously, we need to have that groundwork done, because if you don't, then the payoff of the climax in book 3 is kind of just comes out of nowhere as a Deus Ex. This is the setup to that, establishing and earning that payoff. Also, we talked about. I mean, you mentioned last time
diplomatic emissary for them.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned last time, Matt, that there was always this idea that the Vader aesthetic was supposed to have come from the novel background originally. That was something that was being paid lip service to here.
Yeah, it was sort of like long story short, the idea of what the Sith were hadn't really been established, and so Zahn was playing with the idea that the Noghri in their culture and their connections to Vader, this whole emphasis of calling her Lady Vader, and her sort of honored place and position in their eyes, stemming from the fact she's Vader's daughter, that was all derived from an idea that now would be considered wholly obsolete, that what Darth Vader was the lord of was these things, and that they were the original permutation of the Sith. And so that, that's just one of those things that, much like how the iteration of the Clone Wars that he was working with just conceptually ended up not being in any way really all that relevant. The only bit of it that gets preserved in any sense is the elaboration of C'baoth as a character in later works like the Outbound Flight project and things like that. But everything else was kind of retooled.
Which is also set up here when Luke's into C'baoth's history. The things like the Outbound Flight project, and the Jedi that worked with him to kind of get that going. Like obviously that was all set up here. What exactly happened would obviously not be touched upon until that book and some other stories too. But again, to see where that goes. I am also glad that even though so much of what happened in the past was later retconned, what I should say, what is established about what happened in the past, would later be retconned. I do appreciate that things like Outbound Flight were still created as a way of trying to sort of, make it all make sense to the best of, their ability. Because, again, it's one of those things like they didn't have to do, but I appreciate the fact that they did it.
Yeah. And there's a
maybe
piece of that
maybe
as
we'll get
well.
around to that book someday. We'll see.
Yeah, and there's a piece of it all as well that you mentioned there, Matt, with the Lady Vader aspect. I really like that kind of cold, sinister, kind of thematic choice of having the idea of she's being the heir to Vader, and the concept of the fact that she's carrying Vader's heirs as her children as well. That's it's something that we
Which
don't
also
spend
makes
much
what
time.
happens with Jason a bit depressing too.
Jason, damn you! We'll get to Jason when we get to NJ. God, it winds me up.
Hindsight's 2020, I guess. Unfortunately.
Can I, without taking us wildly off course, is it foundationally as a concept you don't like it, or the fact that he goes like from 0 to 100,
it's
that?
It's just the character portrayal, and again from the get go of NJ. I know he's obviously he comes out a lot earlier than that, but that's when I first was introduced to him. The confidence and just the surety in that kid. It's like, oh my god, you're not Luke. You're not Luke, Jason.
Gotcha.
You're not Luke.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's because his siblings are so much more effortlessly what he wants to be, and he doesn't quite see that while also being jealous of it. Which the whole mixture is like, oh god, Jason, just stop and smell the roses for 5 seconds.
I had made a mistake. I was assuming I was jumping straight to Legacy of the Force, where he goes on a tear, but you actually have issues with him that far predate that. So that'll be interesting.
Maybe it'll have changed now, but I distinctly recall when I read those early NJ books, I'm just like, Jason, just shut the hell up. Seriously, listen to Jaina, listen to Anakin. You don't get as much as you think you get, kid. Like these two know what they're doing. They're accidentally, Luke. You're trying too hard and you're failing. It just anyway, that's a whole different thing. We'll get there when we get to NJ.
That whole dynamic is there's a lot that can be said about that, which we will eventually get into. By the way, can I just say Leia doing all of this while pregnant with twins is it's kind of badass. I mean,
she's always been a badass, hasn't she? Leia is a great character. I mentioned the trope of get the girl earlier with Han, and that's only in the sense that technically they got together, but even in the original trilogy, she was always her own character. She was always one of the best characters back then. She's especially for the time, like she was an archetype that had not been used to death as it has now, and she was always handled with great care, I think, and it carries over into these stories. Like she's making the story weight behind her decisions in this one. I like how it's not just she's making a diplomatic political choice. She's not just being tactical. She actually cares about these people, this culture, and that, going back to the Lady Vader aspect, that kind of sinister overtone in how that history with the Noghri is kind of giving her the cultural authority that she has here, while at the same time she's trying to get to where she needs to get with them for both the Republic and the Noghri's sake, while not leaning into that position, right? She doesn't want to come into this as Lady Vader, but at the same time it's the best tool she has for expedience to getting into them to listen to her. I like that we're seeing the kind of struggle there, where she's trying to go, okay, how do I get where we need to get without exploiting these people who have already been so heavily exploited? And the best part about that is her anger. When she realizes that it's been, obviously, retcon times were off, but in this book it was 40 odd years. The fury that comes about from that is like, I love that. It's such a beautiful layer. It's
moment. Intense.
Yeah, and Chewie as well running in like, who's in trouble? And it's like, I'm fine, Chewie, I'm just angry. Chewie's obviously not got dialogue, but I love how perfectly he's manifested in this story.
He's used perfectly.
It's just so good. It's comical and tense and just so characterful all the way through. Same with R2 as well, because he has the same thing with no dialogue. He's just coming across as that presence.
Yeah. Well, to your point, like the big twist in what she's so angry about is she kind of figures out the fact that, when she puts all the pieces together, the Empire isn't actually cleaning their atmosphere. They're continuing to make it worse, so they'll continue serving them as their commandos, which is obviously really messed up. And that's what kind of drives her to, finally be like, hey, this is what's going on. And the sequence where she exposes the truth to all of them, again, like I can't praise it enough, because like, yes, her fury is at the forefront, but also the way that she kind of logically shows them the evidence, and the sort of blank shock that the Noghri have, like some believe her instantly, others are instantly disbelieving, even though she is Lady Vader, the fact that she doesn't have total sway over it. And I also, again, really subtle, I like how Timothy Zahn emphasizes the age groups of the Noghri, and how each of the age groups kind of have their own unique sort of reactions. Like, you have the much older members who are like a bit more disbelieving because they were they've lived under the Empire's yoke for so long. You have the really, really young ones who are like more willing to believe her because, like, they're a bit more, some of them are a bit more open-minded. And then you have like the ones quite literally in the middle. Half of them are kind of split one way, half of them are kind of split the other. It's like, oh my God, the Empire lied to us. No, we still need to serve them. She's the one who's lying. Again, saying a lot with a little, and it's really nice that she doesn't just instantly convince all of them. The fact that she kind of has, dang it all, the fact that she has to really, go the extra mile to do this, and the fact that it doesn't work instantly with all of them. It's a nice way of starting up the fracture, which ultimately leads into Thrawn's ultimate downfall in the third book. Set up and payoff.
And I like how you've got the two different groups as well. Some of them are more willing to lean into the fact and recognize heritage as the heir to Vader as well, and others are like, no, it doesn't matter. We're not, we don't actually think that way. It shows that they're not just the single culture that thinks the single, shares this one perspective. Like you said, the generational kind of institutionalization has taken root to different degrees. I think that works really well.
Yeah, it's a nice little reverse. Well, I wouldn't say reversal, but it's a nice, like, different sort of. It's kind of like Ewok God 3PO, except a bit more.
Yeah.
There's a bit more to it in that it's not just they're all instantly on the same side. It's like there's a bit more like like I said, a fracturing to it, which is nice.
Speaking of Ewoks, it made me laugh when Thrawn was like, "Well, I think they must be truly desperate if they're relying on the Ewoks for protection." When that came up, as they're just leaving the
he just scoffed at it, like, when somebody's, they must be hiding. There's like, what, among the Ewoks? Whatever, that's stupid. Like, it was more like mocking the suggestion, like not really how desperate are they? Just like, what? Don't be dumb,
Yeah, like, exactly. It was so funny. Also, the visual as well of the idea that the Millennium Falcon was left just parked in orbit of Endor and just to be able to be picked up. I was like, oh god, this is going to get poorly. I'd forgotten the fact that it was used as the escape vehicle on the destroyer as well. So I enjoyed the kind of the thread there, the narrative thread that ties it all together. I thought it was a really good choice. Which I mentioned it before. The whole escape from the Death Star. But it's not that. It's riffing off that. The whole escape from the Star Destroyer with Card's recovery by Luke and Mara. I really enjoyed that sequence. That is essentially just a complete rehash of the Death Star escape, right? But it's as with everything in this story, he goes such depths to make it feel like it's realized and an actual part of the world. And these are characters that we've had enough time now to kind of truly appreciate both sides of it, Luke and Mara. And it's also a new dynamic for the two. Like it's a very simple kind of plot premise, but it ties nicely as like that middle point in the story where you've got everybody coming together under the Thrawn umbrella of threat to be, okay, now we're at the point with this crux point where we need to get this one piece of the puzzle out and on the Republic side. It feels like a real character victory and kind of story crux. So I really enjoyed all of that. Had a lot of fun with it.
Well, I would actually say Mara probably had one of the best evolutions from the previous book. Her sort of the character arc that she goes on, I really, really appreciate it. It's not just like a pure revenge quest anymore, because although those dynamics are obviously still there, she definitely feels
you will
like
kill Luke Skywalker every 2 seconds. It always makes me laugh when that comes up. It's like, you will kill him.
I also love Thrawn's test for her. Like, he's just been waiting to whip that out. Just like, like you had this set up. Like, okay, well, all right. Well, actually, on the off chance she reveals herself,
Yeah, well, actually, if we're gonna, like, speaking with that actually has one of my favorite bits of prose from just the entire book, when she tries to, like, force choke him. Basically, let me just
at you. I'm laughing with you. The story, yeah. Go
no,
ahead.
I know. Like, I'll just read a little bit of it. Mara glared at him and lashed out again. This time with the Force. Thrawn frowned slightly, fingers moving across his neck as if trying to brush away an intangible cobweb. Mara leaned into her tenuous grip on his throat, and he brushed again at his neck before understanding came. All right, that's enough, he said, his voice noticeably altered, his tone starting to get angry. Stop it, or Rook will have to hurt you. Mara ignored the order, digging in as hard as she could. Thrawn gazed unblinkingly back at her, his throat muscles moving as he fought against the grip. Mara clenched her teeth, waiting for the order or hand movement that would signal permission for the Noghri to choke her, or for the stormtroopers to burn her down. But Thrawn remained silent and unmoving, and a minute later, gasping for breath, Mara had to concede defeat. Limits of your small powers, Thrawn said coldly, fingering his throat. But at last, he didn't sound amused anymore. A little trick the Emperor taught you. I really appreciate that little back and forth. First of all, him describing the Force choke as like, brushing at cobwebs. It's a good way of like differentiating what she's doing from what we've seen from like people like Darth Vader, because at this point her powers are still very restrained. Although this is actually one of the most active uses of the Force that we ever see her do in this trilogy. And I also like the fact that it emphasizes how that little bit of defiance really shook Thrawn up, even though it was ultimately unsuccessful. I like the fact that his little veneer of confidence did crack somewhat, because obviously when it comes to things like the Force, that's also been one of his blind spots for obvious reasons. But the fact that, first of all, it's the first time he ever takes any physical damage in this trilogy so far.
So the fact as well, which is telling.
Exactly. The fact that he was like noticeably unsettled by that, even though it was ultimately unsuccessful, is nice. That little back and forth there is I think really nice. The way they just, again, from the description of the choke to his reaction, you could just see him like doing like this a little bit, but he's still kind of holding on, and you can just see like Mara like straining, maybe like some sweat going down her face as she's trying to get it work, but she can't quite do it. And the fact that he even calls her like her small powers, like it makes me wonder, he's probably seen Vader or Sidious do that to somebody, so he knows the full scope. But the fact that she can't quite do the same thing is probably why he said something like that. At least that's how I always interpreted it.
Yeah, I never got too much out of that moment myself. Also. Yeah, it is, saving face, like you say, Matt. But also the bit that made it not quite as powerful for me was the fact this goes on for a minute. Like he's standing there like with everyone else just sort of watching for like a minute straight. I would have taken that out just to kind of lend it a bit more believability and have it be more like a 5-second thing rather than an extended moment. But like you say, I love the cobweb description, that kind of that ephemeral kind of nothing to tear away strength that she's only just managed to grasp onto before she managed to lean into it more. I think that was a really cool piece of prose there. Excuse me.
Yeah. And not to bring Outbound Flight into this, but there is actually a sequence towards the end of that book where Thrawn gets legitimately or attempted to get choked out, ironically by Joruus C'baoth, the template for Joruus. That obviously wasn't successful, but the fact that he's actually experienced the full scope of that, it makes you wonder if one of the reasons he was unsettled was because that was reminding him of something he's actually experienced. To a certain degree.
It also raises the question why he didn't have a Salamari rack on his back at this point, because as far as he's concerned, Joruus could turn up at any moment. So that's probably a miscalculation on his part there.
I mean, it could have. Maybe it was in the room, but just too far, and maybe he just didn't know he could. I mean, because he even says like, "Oh, a trick the Emperor taught you." He probably didn't know she could do that. So
yeah, I think it's okay. There's a fair amount of the fact that it is an alien concept to him as well. Like you said, he would have seen it, but it's not fully kind of appreciated in how much it can come out of you out of left field. But yeah, no, it wasn't a problem that he hadn't prepared for it with her. It was just, to me, it seemed makes sense that he should always have one with him as long as he's got Joruus alive and in his sphere. Yeah. But yeah, no, it's a good point. And your point about Mara as well being one of the most developed of the characters, I think, is very, very poignant, because her presence in this story, she's kind of the connective tissue between all the different Venn diagram collections of characters. Most of this story is just different collections of characters paired together and moved up and doing different things throughout. And she's kind of one of the, along with Thrawn, she's kind of the connective tissue that brings them all together and keeps that all cohesive in what she's getting up to a lot of the time. With probably the exception of Han and Lando, who are doing their own thing. On that, actually, I liked that they failed on the casino sequence they did. I liked that there was failure throughout this book that didn't feel wasted in terms of narrative effort. We had a lot of time spent on different sequences they were going through, but the characters weren't winning all the time. And I like that we see that they're struggling with that. They're feeling the stress and burden of, oh my god, we need to get this right now. We can't keep messing up, etc. That was well handled. And particularly interesting as well, because when I was going through this, I was enjoying this book all the way through, right? But by the end of it, in my head, I'm thinking, why was it not annoying me that they effectively the entire story is a character goes somewhere, does something, moves on, goes somewhere, does something, moves on? Like, I know it sounds very reductive and that pretty much every story can be that, but there is a lot
That
of
is,
going
what
to
happens.
somewhere,
Yeah.
going to somewhere and doing a specific thing and moving on and going. There's a lot of jumping from place to place, having a conversation, going to another place, having another conversation, meeting characters in similar spheres, similar kind of contexts. But it never bothers me at all. I love it all.
On
It's-
paper, that description doesn't even bother me. I mean, that is so situational to me. Like, I
Mm.
mean, I think it's all a question of like, what are the characters accomplishing, and how much time is spent on any given thing, and what did you demand of the audience to sit through that?
And what's the
So,
content
like,
of the character debating conversations?
Mhm.
Like, what are they sharing
Right.
between each other? Like, it doesn't.
Yeah.
The plot doesn't matter. It's the story, right? Of each of these
This is why it
sequences, and
feels
that
a little bit
story
more
is
like a
changing.
television series than a movie to me, because the plan keeps changing depending on new information, and
Yeah.
it's like Lando's the key to making a lot of that work, because he just knows so many things that aren't common knowledge, and he never comes off just like a cheap crystal ball full of like the next bit of information you need. Even though that's kind of how he's used, it always feels earned and justified, and so he's the one that.
And they all share that space as well, because sometimes
Yeah.
Han has the key, sometimes Luke has the key, so sometimes
Sure.
Wedge comes in with it. You know, there's it's shared
Sure,
out, even though
but
he's
Lando,
mostly
Yeah.
the one with them.
Lando, more than most, and he calls it out, is the one dragged in directions he didn't mean to go in when things started. So, like, as the plan changes and shifts, he has like both a human relatable reaction to it, and just frustration at times, including at Luke. But also he tends to be used in the most like, I'm going to keep quiet right now, but I know that this is at least partially bullshit what we're listening to. It's a big deal. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, kind of a thing. And that works because the characters know each other, even though Han's like, this is so weird, I'm going to call you out for being rude. Han's going to say you're being rude.
Yeah,
Like, you know what I
exactly,
mean?
exactly. Obviously, that's the answer to the question. Like, when I'm asking why is this not bothering me, why, considering this is basically characters go to place, have conversation, go to next place, have conversation, that's not a problem. But if you have to have the story reframed in each of those pretty much identical plot scenarios, and he does that first of all. But on top of that, each one has a new ingredient, a new piece of the character journey for each of the combinations of characters. Lando and Han being the prime example. Lando, I mean, we mentioned before earlier on that this pairing is one of my favorite in the trilogy. But Lando, in this one in particular, he's willing and he's stepping up and he's doing the right thing and he's going on this journey. But I love how he's also kind of begrudging, because like, I'm being dragged out of what I'm supposed to be doing again. You're just kind of taking me for granted here that I will just come along with it, and I will because we're friends. But also I'm having this, like you said, this very human reaction to the chafing under that, and like, I didn't get a choice here. Can you at least ask? Maybe, I love that we get the little ingredients of that, but it never feels
call
like
it out.
Yeah,
So it helped.
The scene, we were talking a little bit off camera when we had a little bit of an unintentional break. The fact that you didn't listen to these as on audiobook, Callan, like you were physically reading these. I mean, Mark Thompson does a brilliant job voice. I mean, he sounds like Luke to me when he's being Luke, but I mean, he does a great job with Han and Lando, and so the back and forth of the two of them, it really feels like a radio drama. It almost, because of the strength of Zahn's actual writing and the strength of Thompson's performance, it feels almost like an improv, like going back and forth between the two characters. But my favorite sequence in this book has always been the bit where Lando gets a whiff of like, this is the Katana Fleet, and like in explaining what that is. It's kind of like, because it's kind of introduced in the very scene in which he's saying this is what it is. So it's like, it's a way of like, it wasn't like, oh, way back at the beginning of book one, there's rumors of like this Katana Fleet out there. It's like, no, I'm dropping the concept on you as I'm saying this is what we're stumbling into. And the sense of the use of music in the audio drama as well is perfect. It's very, very like foreboding and kind of like, but without being like the Emperor's throne room chamber music. It's really good. It's just really,
the
really
scene
strong
itself,
stuff.
just the written prose as well, really captures that vibe, because obviously they're in this unfamiliar territory. They've just had the fact that, the soothing aspect of the fact that this isn't necessarily an antagonist location. This isn't necessarily a threat to them, but it's still unfamiliar and they're strangers in a different crowd. So it's capturing that. But also I love the fact that it isn't just that, oh look, this upholstery was only used for this fleet. That must be where they're getting these dreadnoughts from. No, let's continue. Let's go back to the bar. Let's check this. That he does a really good job of making sure this feels like the decision-making process that actual people would have in these scenarios, and that goes for the entirety of the trilogy, but particularly for this book. He really sells that kind of detective investigator experience that these two in particular are on through that kind of what would our
I just
actual
want to say,
decision making be here?
Well,
yeah, can I just, before we move on from this, I just want to say, like, this isn't a particularly like in-depth thought, but the Katana Fleet as a concept, I think, is like my favorite concept introduced in the whole trilogy. It's just such a cool, like, scary thing, you know. I was convinced they were going to steal it when I saw the trailer for Rise of Skywalker, and instead they did something just even worse. Like, they should have stolen it rather than doing what they did. Like when they showed all those, like, you know, like
Yeah.
Star Destroyers out of nowhere. Yeah, I
No, they just
thought,
came out of nowhere and
well,
were
is that the
manned
Katana
by
Fleet?
people.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the
They
fact that
just-
might as
in
well
this
have
book
been.
they're raising the points that
even
everyone was
worse.
raising about that problem. In the sequel trilogy, everyone's
Yeah.
like, "Oh, who cares about this? We care. It matters for the world to
Yes.
feel real. It matters. These ships can't come out of nowhere without a good reason. They can't be manned without a good reason. You know, these are things that add. These are story problems to be solved by the characters, and he litters this trilogy on the micro and the macro scale with those story beats and those character decisions.
It's also the
It sells
perfect
it so
tool that
perfectly.
for the villain he's set up. You do not want that to wind up in the hands of a character like Thrawn. You don't particularly want it in the hands of anybody, but Thrawn's like the worst character. I mean, Thrawn would do things with it that you wouldn't necessarily fear the Emperor doing with it. You know, because the Emperor doesn't operate that way. Like Thrawn is the perfect character, like we don't want him to get this. You know, it's just a really great setup. I love it. Great concept.
Yeah, and on the back of that, with Thrawn being obviously the last person you want to get hold of these ships, and this kind of this device that he's come up with as being the threat for this book, which I agree is a really solid choice for this character. We have the clever choice as well of having the pacing of the plot and story upping in stakes around this same kind of point. Once we've got the recovery of Card from the Star Destroyer, and it becomes, I mean, it's stated as it's now a race. You know, everything that after that point, it's the same kind of content that came before in terms of the context, as I said, but it's not about the plotting; it's about the story. And you're seeing the tension, you're seeing the strain of the characters as they're struggling to make sure we get to the information we need to the people who need it, so that we can capture this fleet before the enemy does. Having that recontextualized from the reader's perspective, and the fact that Thrawn himself now acknowledges this is a race against time, helps get kind of that ticking clock element come into play a bit more, and feel like we're really on the full the final tear towards the conclusion of the plot. You know, the climax of the story. I thought it was well timed within the story.
And for why this fleet was hidden for so long, the fact that it's like off the grid on like that hyperspace lanes in a place, you know, far removed from the galactic core. It is very much believable, and I like the way that they big up the legend of the Dark Force and how everybody has their own unique reaction to it. Like when Luke hears about it, he was like, you know, even growing up on like a desolate farm on Tatooine, even I know what the story of the Katana Fleet. Or Pelion, I also love his reaction too. When he first hears about it, someone who, you know, when he tells Thrawn, like, oh, I once had dreams of finding the Katana Fleet myself, and then Thrawn's reaction, you know, everyone in your generation did. Again, saying a lot with a little bit, you know, that sort of Pelion being the militaristic mind who's always, you know, obviously, you know, space travel, space combat being his thing. The fact that Thrawn makes that description, not just with the character's age, but also his occupation, again, saying a lot with a little, and I really appreciate that. And the fact that like he just knows, he like knew Pelion was going to say something like that, also speaks to, you know, how they understand each other.
Yeah, and it also helps pick up the fleet as a threat as well, because it's kind of that storybook, you know, the boy with the treasure map kind of feel. You know, it's kind of, that's the fantasy every kid or every young man had at that time. You know, when that was the fairy tale being told around that era. You know, it was the one of its time. Helps make it be much more of a physical threat.
Yeah, and the fact that one of the major plot points, which we kind of alluded to earlier, is the Empire. I think it's Han who brings this up. He's like, well, even if they get the fleet, it would take them months to, you know, get the recruits necessary to, you know, actually pilot them. But that leads into the main twist at the end, being that the soldiers that the Empire is currently using are clones. And the sheer horror on Han and Luke and Lando's, you know, face when they sort of because it's literally the last scene of the book when they realize that it's clones, and just the horror setting in. Excellent way of teeing up the Last Command, you know, the final act in this trilogy, because it's like, oh dang, the worst person to have this weapon just got the weapon, and now he has a method of staffing it with people who will instantly be loyal to him and instantly be trained to use them. This is bad. And the sheer horror of that is just excellently done. And it also ties back to a lot of the, they've made a lot of allusions to cloning, even in the previous book with like a lot of the technologies of Wayland, and that the Emperor was keeping in storage. So I like how that all comes full circle in the end, and will obviously be paid off on in Last Command.
Yeah, the single beat as well within that context, because you mentioned the horror of it. I really liked the little nods within the action sequence where Han is getting into the closed off turret emplacement, and he reacts, and we don't get any explanation for what he's reacting to, but the obvious implication being that he's just found one of the very long dead corpses that didn't get cleaned up by the droids because it was in this container away from where they'd be able to detect it. And yeah, never actually touches on that or explains it or anything. Doesn't go into after fact. It was that afterwards. You're just left with that to sit in it, and he's kind of operating this turret with like a corpse right next to him effectively, then leaves and moves on. It's I just thought it was a really cool choice from the author's part. It's like kind of helps reestablish what, because obviously it's very clinical and washed off in the fact that they're not seeing these bodies lying around everywhere when they get into the fleet, but it keeps that sinister overtone to what was meant. The story of the Katana Fleet that we've had told throughout this plot.
Speaking of the climax, I really had a moment of catharsis when Phalia got exposed by Leia turning on the comm and listening to that whole speech, and then the fleet instantly turning against him. I mean, there's something about that was very satisfying, and the fact that both Leia and Card sort of talking around Phalia, the characterization that is brilliant, and the fact that he kind of alerts to Leia subtly of what she should do, and the fact that she has just enough force presence to hit the button on the speaker, and then Card is going to keep him talking in such a way where what he says is going to cause the fleet to turn against him, because he reveals that he really doesn't care about them. He just sees them as drones to further his political ambitions. All of that was so well done. It not only bigs up Card, it bigs up Leia, and it also bigs up the loyalty of the New Republic forces, because even though there's some division in between the ranks, the fact that they're all willing to come together for this singular cause, even if they ultimately don't succeed, is really it's good to see. And it's a good way of highlighting, for all its flaws, the New Republic really did come together in the end and actually establish itself for a very long time. And it wasn't until the Vong showed up that things really went all to dust, but you could hardly blame them for that one. So that's all really nice.
It does raise the question of how Borsk's failure ever fucking came back from this, because the fact that he's still in power in the future is how are you covering this? How did you manage to get through this weather the storm? Although with everything going on in the modern life at the moment,
I mean, he pulls a gun on Leia.
People can accomplish much more about much worse things.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's another talk for another time. One of the things I love about this, though, because this climax we talked about a bit earlier before we started recording, suffers a little bit from the same issues that we talked about with the first book, in that it feels very compressed. Everything's happening very quickly. But it isn't a bother for me here in the same way as it was a little bit for the first book, because one, action of this type with the fleet battles and the fighting aboard the ships, etc., you can only drag that out so long before it starts being too cumbersome anyway. It has to be relatively high pace for the action to be sold to the reader. So that's not an issue by itself. But also, and this is to Cezanne's particular credit, he does an excellent job of threading in character and beats and decision making, like you said, with the whole kind of crux of that being the conversation with Phalia and the recording exposure. But everything with Han, Luke, and Lando on the dreadnought, with Mara being ejected into space outside the with those Z95, with the arrival of Garm Bel Iblis and the Peregrine and the 6 dreadnoughts, with in particular the kind of the flipping of the turning of the tide moment, with Han saying, "Okay, now we're out of the fight," after he's just rammed the dreadnought into he does a good job of keeping the pacing going, but also making sure that every moment is dripping with character. It's dripping with the dialogue choices. It's dripping with the actual set pieces of what we're visually seeing on page, as though it's like a film. He's captured that cinematic experience perfectly, and also in the flavor of Star Wars. Making it once again just, this is the sequel to the original trilogy we never got.
Yeah. And Thrawn not participating in the fight, because of C'baoth coming over to complain about him.
Yeah, he's like,
getting jumped.
What? I'm very busy right now. It
is very much that, which is
comical.
Again, it's obviously an intentional, sequence for him not to be there, but to that, I do like the fact that even though they succeed, he himself is still disappointed in the fact that one of their main Star Destroyers got destroyed, because sure, they have the Katana Fleet now and they're amassing these resources, but this is still an empire that's very, very much strained. Every soldier, every ship, every Star Destroyer counts. So the fact that Thrawn still takes that as a bit of a loss, even though the entire thing was ultimately a success. Again, it's a nice little way of speaking to his character.
And it's also very well delivered in the alarming aspect that the Republic has got, 15, 14 at the end of this dreadnoughts out of this deal, and the Empire has the remaining, 180 odd, because they've,
the better part of 200. I can't remember how many there were.
Yeah, it's about 180 because Garm Bel Iblis has a few, obviously, himself. So yeah, it's not a great situation for the Republic to be in leading into the third book, and obviously because of the,
Empire
like you
Strikes
said,
Back.
the clones.
It's Empire Strikes Back.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Exactly, and
so.
it's now striking back all over again because we've got the urgency that's been kind of lacking up to this point. It's not that that's a problem, but just in the nature of the first two books, we're building up to the threat of Thrawn. It's it's the impending shadow coming across. Now he's here and he's got the weapons to wield that we really didn't want him to. So yeah, looking forward to going into book 3. Actually, more than I expected.
Yeah, me too.
This has been a really good.
I can't wait to learn about this thing called the Clone Wars they keep alluding to.
I know, right? It's so funny. Obviously, you don't blame him at all for getting it all wrong, because of course he guessed that this was going to be what it was meant by that. But yeah, it's always funny seeing that. Having said that, we talk about the discrepancies and the inconsistencies, etc. Even with those noted, it's amazing how well everything holds together. It's very easy to hand wave a lot of this stuff and just massage the numbers a bit to keep it playing.
There was nothing foundationally flawed with what he went with. He was just writing it before the original creator decided to go in a completely different way. He was writing it in a vacuum.
Exactly.
That's
but
all.
even once that vacuum was
time.
shifted, though, and even contradicted some of the stuff he said, it's surprising to me how much of this holds up despite that.
I think
it's not anything chasmless at all.
Outbound Flight, I think, was sort of a let's honor this work because it's so seminal to the EU and fans' experience. Mm-hmm. I think they would not have gone out of their way to try to make it work as much as they did if it wasn't so beloved. So I think it's kind of a cyclical thing. It's not just blind luck or happenstance there, because he's also the author, I mean to say, is very frank about concepts of, the whole Noghri Sith thing is just dead, you know what I mean? But he explains, this is where I was coming from at the time, and it makes total sense, for example. But yeah, the rest of it is, I think that I won't say they walked on eggshells around him, because obviously they did change the whole thing, and not just in terms of the time frames, but the whole concept of what the Clone Wars were. But I think that they went out of their way to try to keep as much of it intact because he did such a service of keeping the franchise alive. And at the exact midpoint between the two trilogies, you've got 83 as Jedi comes out, and then this began in 91, and then in 99. That's when you get Phantom Menace coming out. So he really wrote the sequel trilogy.
Kept the dream alive, to quote one of my least favorite characters in the new
absolutely. I think, like I said at the beginning, to me, this really is an example of a perfect sequel. It took the characters and the stories as established in Heir to the Empire and used them as a jumping off point for something better. The characterization is much more fluid. The transitions, the writing, the overall stakes, everything here really is a very smooth evolution from what came before. And, like we said, a few continuity flubs notwithstanding, the fact that it holds up the way that it does really does speak to the strength of the writing, and just the fact that everything feels so natural in a way that not only is difficult with sequels, but just, Star Wars content in general, keeping that character voice, keeping that character consistency, introducing new characters like he's done, but making them feel integral. It really does succeed on almost every level. So yeah, I can't recommend this enough. I would definitely say this is also my favorite of the trilogy at this moment. Whether or not that'll change with Last Command, we'll see, because like Matt, I haven't read that in quite some time, so we'll see where that goes. But right now, I gotta say this is definitely an A+ recommendation from me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to having my mind changed by Last Command, because I haven't read it since, I probably only read it once. So since the first time I read it, 13, 14, 15 years ago, I haven't read it since then. But yeah, I really love this book. I didn't have quite as much to say, I think, because it's all just so good, and a lot of the stuff we talked about. Yeah, a lot of the stuff that we talked about what made the first one good carried over here, and all the context behind the discrepancies, for example, which do not bother me in the slightest because, of course, they don't. But it's just it's a really great book, and yeah, I'm looking forward to going through the third one, much more so than I would have thought. Because I don't think to reread these all that often. This is Callan's fault that we're doing this, so I should say to your credit.
I picked up the book and went,
Yeah.
this was the top of the pile, and I felt the yearning. So yeah, I'm very glad we did go for it. I just want to add one last final thing as well, because I meant to mention it earlier. Everything we've said that holds true for the primary characters, both original trilogy and new that have been brought in for this trilogy, holds true for the secondary and tertiary characters as well. I just wanted to add that because that was something that really helped sell the in betweens of this book, of this series, particularly this book. Yeah, I really liked all of the minor ones that come up just once or twice throughout the different scene pieces, and that are being set up more for book 3 as well. Thought it was excellent. But yeah, what these guys said, really enjoyed this and looking forward to book 3. Yeah, it's going to be fun. But until then, this has been our analysis of Thrawn Trilogy Book 2, Dark Force Rising. Remember the title again. I am Callan, and I still don't have an outro.
It should have been called the Katana Fleet, I think.
It really
this is
should
Matt. Thanks for watching.
Read on that point. Evanova 95. We hope you guys enjoyed. See you guys later.
Goodbye.